And when I got the word that evening, when we had a break in patrols, I pulled the whole company in and gave them the news.
One of the things that really this guy Phillips, he literally interviewed like everyone that came in contact with Jason over that time period. And this story as it unfolds is very it's so detailed, and it gives people an insight into not just the frontline troops, whatever that's in the service and what they're doing, the medical folks. There's a section right here that harkens back a little bit to that. It says, Al-Assad, Iraq, on the morning of April 14th, Becky Sparks, commander of Alpha Surgical Company, received an email with new instructions from the chief surgeon of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. The title, Treatment of Expectant Patients, would have struck a civilian as out of place in a hospital in the middle of a combat zone. But in battlefield medicine, expectant means quite the opposite of what it does in the faraway world of maternity wards and delivery rooms. An expectant mother is expected to create life. An expected soldier is expected to die. So here's the email. Occasionally in our triage of patients in the combat environment, we classify patients as expectant, the chief surgeon wrote. With multiple casualties, these patients have our lowest priority for care, but they have the highest priority for care for another member of our Navy Marine Corps team, the chaplain. An expectant patient does not always die. Expectant means you expect something to happen, and most often it is death, but sometimes after the higher priority patients have been treated, an expectant patient survives. Their care should be continued with the resources that can be committed. Heroic efforts may seem to be helpful in the short run, but if resources are expended when the next patient arrives, then you have not helped this latter patient. This is when judgments are critical, and I would dare say that very, very few of us have enough experience to make these decisions easily. When the decisions must be made, talk about it, include your entire team in your decisions, and move on. If the patient is expectant, make sure that he is comfortable and that someone stays with him until something happens. If the patient does die, document the death appropriately. At the 7 a.m. staff meeting, Commander Sparks, a brisk woman whose auburn hair and bright lipstick stood out next to the black 9mm pistol hanging from her shoulder, passed the chief surgeon's message along to her physicians. She briefly discussed it with them, highlighting the advice that doctors revisit the expectant ones once they have treated the other patients. Then she moved on to other issues. That afternoon, Jason Dunham arrived at Alpha Surgical Company, expected to die. In Alpha Surgical Company's contingency plan for dealing with mass casualty event, responsibility for the expectant ward fell on the Navy dental team. They had enough general knowledge to push intravenous fluids into a dying man, but not enough to be much use in the trauma ward operating room or intensive care unit. Dental technician first class Christopher Graham, who had helped carry Jason's stretcher in from the helicopter, had been waiting outside the emergency room while the doctors completed their triage. After 15 minutes, the door opened and an order emerged from the chaos. Please take this patient to the expectant ward. Graham and three others carried Corporal Dunham's litter to a dim, white-tiled room with a pair of broken shower stalls. A tape above the door read washroom. All the sawhorses were in use elsewhere, so the litter team carefully placed the stretcher on the floor. Graham sat by the corporal's side across from Rachel Sterling, a 21-year-old dental technician, third class. Sterling had chosen service in the Navy because her grandfather and great-uncle had been sailors. Navy Lieutenant James L. Harris III, a 32-year-old dentist from Crockett, Texas, joined them in the expectant ward and did as did the chaplain, Lieutenant Lentz. Then they waited for Corporal Dunham to die. For 45 minutes, they spoke to him in soft voices, holding his hands and stroking his limp, muscular arms as Lieutenant Harris pushed fluids and painkillers into his veins from an IV sac. The Marine Corps is proud of you, and we're all proud of you, Graham told him. Well, obviously, Dunham was a fighter and wasn't ready to give up. Makes it to Germany, and again, I think shows up in Germany. And this is the situation he was in. Jason was hooked up to a plethora of medical equipment over the course of the day. There was an intracranial pressure monitor. There was a catheter that passed through his urethra to drain his bladder into a bag. A line ran into his left femoral artery to monitor his blood pressure and allow the nurses to draw blood samples easily. He had a rectal temperature probe. On the right side of his groin was a triple-headed catheter running into a vein for IV fluids and drugs. There was an endotracheal tube in his mouth to facilitate the passage of air between the ventilator and his lungs, plus a suction tube to draw excess fluid from his lungs and an oral gastric tube to suck out stomach acid. Compression sleeves on both calves alternately squeezed and relaxed to keep blood moving through his legs to prevent clots. 5 pads on his chest monitor his heart rate. A blood oxygen monitor was clipped onto his finger. A blood pressure cuff was on his arm in case the automatic reading failed. The nurses put a sterile plastic cup under each ear to collect the cerebrospinal fluid that continued to drain out of his eardrums. So, he's in horrible condition. Horrible condition. And he's on the brink of dying this whole time. These medical folks in the military are doing everything they can. They're making heroic efforts. And they want to get him stable enough so that they can get him back to America at a minimum. And they're actually able to do that. And of course, at this time, Jason's mom and dad had been notified that their son had been wounded. And this is one thing that's, I don't know what the protocol is when someone gets killed. There's a knock on the door. When someone's wounded, depending on the severity and how well it's known, and I don't know what they do in the Marine Corps, in the SEAL teams, they're going to still try and give someone a knock on the door. But what Deb and Dan got was a phone call. Hey, we don't know what's going on. We don't have much information, but Jason's been wounded. And if I remember correctly, they didn't even get like a massive amount of criticality. They weren't quite sure. But they do find out that he's coming. They get down to DC, Bethesda area, and Jason, the medical personnel in Germany are able to get him stable enough to send him back. And when he lands back in America, this is what unfolds. 39-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Jim Byrne was working as a federal prosecutor going after Colombian drug traffickers when he volunteered for active duty. He expected to end up at the naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, prosecuting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda suspects. Instead, the Marines sent him to Bethesda to head the liaison unit. Burns drove to Andrews Air Force Base Wednesday night to meet the plane from Germany and watch the crew load Corporal Dunham's litter into a private ambulance waiting on the tarmac. The colonel sat for a few minutes next to Jason. The noise from the plane was deafening, and Byrne leaned over to speak into his ear. "Welcome back, hero. We're going to take care of you." It was the colonel's standard greeting for a wounded man. Byrne had no idea if Jason could hear him, but just in case, he explained that they were at the airbase where the president's plane landed and that he was going to be taken to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda. And when he gets there, this is where his mom and dad, Jason's mom and dad, Dan and Deb, finally get to see him. Dan and Deb walked into the room and saw Jason lying naked on his back, a towel covering his groin and a catheter tube running to a urine bag by the foot of his bed. His head was wrapped in gauze, and the left side of his face was a mask of purple and red. He wore a neck brace that tilted his head slightly. Both eyes were still swollen shut, and the Dunhams imagined an empty left eye socket beneath the inflammation. His lips and tongue, which protruded next to the plastic breathing tube, looked parched. The ventilator moved his chest up and down in perfect robotic rhythm. His feet curled down towards each other in an exaggerated pigeon-toed position. Dan thought he looked thin, as if his muscles were already fading. Deb thought he looked cold. "I'd love to put a blanket on him," she said. "I know that's the instinct," the nurse responded, "but we're trying to keep him cool." Deb sat in a chair on Jason's more heavily damaged left side, and Dan sat across from her. They each held one of Jason's hands, and they held each other's hands across Jason's stomach. "We love you," Dan assured Jason. "You're going to be all right." "Hi, honey," Deb said. "We're here. You're home, and we're here." So, again, at this point, I mean, you guys still are working. Did you guys have? I mean, Ferg, you had seen Jason, and probably were the most, aware, mentally, while you're getting him Casavac. What were you thinking? Did you think he was going to live? Did you think?
What I had told the platoon and what I was thinking is if he survived the first 24 hours, that kind of going along with the no news was good news thing. So it was like day 4 or 5, and we started having really a lot of hope. because at that time, obviously stabilized. We haven't heard nothing by then, so and that's what I kind of told the platoon. When